So it's 9:30 on Sunday morning, and we're ready to continue our study of Genesis here at Santa Cruz Community Church. I'm John Heberling, retired pastor and teacher of Scripture. We're finishing up the book of Genesis, actually. Probably will finish it next Sunday, and then the Sunday after, I'm going to be preaching. Dan has a Sunday off, and Jerry will be teaching. I'm not sure what he's going to teach, but he's got a little time yet to figure that out. Anyway, we are at the 48th chapter of Genesis, and there's 50 chapters, so you can see we're almost there. Now, some interesting and I think important things are happening here, but things that probably when you just read Genesis, you think, what is this? And kind of skip over it. Joseph has made himself known to the family and has persuaded his father, took some persuading to persuade his father to come to Egypt to finish. And it's obvious in reading this that they intended just to be there till the famine was over, but we know they stayed there for, I think a couple of times it says 400 years. So the very aged Jacob, he's like 130 years old, and definitely an old man at that time. And so he, with all the family, comes to Egypt, and he's reassured by God just before he goes to Egypt that he can do this. God promises that they will come back. And we'll notice a couple of things in this text that indicate that God is working through his plan. You know, the book of Genesis is the story of the patriarchs. We presume written by Moses, perhaps using documents that were kept by the family, and giving us a foundation. We're going to, in Exodus, begin with Moses and the people in slavery and the bringing them out. But where does this all come from? Where did this nation of people who have been enslaved in Egypt come from? Well, that's the theme of the book of Genesis. So Abraham is, and you don't want to think that Genesis is about people seeking God and finding him as if God was lost, or as if he had his back turned and was saying, I dare you to find me. No, the book of Genesis and the whole Bible is about God seeking man. God finds Abraham. Abraham doesn't find God. God breaks through to Abraham and calls him. I think another thing we want to notice in the book of Genesis is how patient God is. God has a plan, and he's working his plan. He works his plan not by putting it all in place and turning people into puppets. He works his plan by silently, without us even noticing, arranging things that come out the way he wants them. So he calls Abram early and then patiently waits while Abram's father gets old and dies, and then he calls Abram again. 20, 30 years have passed here, and Abram follows this time, takes Lot along with him, but he goes into the land that God is calling him to. And the story of the patriarchs begins. Then we go through Isaac, and then we get to Jacob. That's what we've been talking about, Jacob, for the last several weeks. God is handing this covenant down from Abraham to Isaac, from Isaac to Jacob. And Jacob is a challenge. I say God is finding men. He finds Jacob as the younger son of the twins, of Isaac. And Jacob becomes quite a project for God. I think when we read about Abraham, our tendency would be to say, well, Abraham was a marvelous man. Unfortunately, I'm no Abraham, and almost the same thing with Isaac. But when you get to Jacob, you see somebody who's got the same kinds of personality problems and sin problems that the rest of us have. And God patiently works with him, calls him. Jacob is sort of doing it himself in the early part of his life, but then God breaks into his life and calls him and gives him the same promises that he gave to Abraham and Isaac, that he would be a great family. Now, how do we get from Abraham, who has one son, and Isaac, who has one? Abraham has two sons, but only one is part of the covenant. Isaac has two sons, but only one is part of the covenant. And God keeps saying, I'm going to make a big nation of you. People so many that they can't be counted, like the sand, grains of sand on the seashore, or the stars in the sky, so many people. So how do we go about doing this? Well, with Jacob, we see God's next move to do this, that Jacob has 12 sons. And so now we're beginning to see a family that's growing. But way back early on in the 15th chapter of Genesis, we have this long conversation between God and Abraham. And Abraham is kind of discouraged at this point and saying, really, God? I don't have a son, and how do I know all this is really happening? And God gives him reassurances, and then says, incidentally, I guess, that your people will become a great family, a nation, actually, from a family to a clan, to a tribe, to a nation. And he says they will spend 400 years in another country, in Egypt, but I will bring them back and I will give them this land. So now they're in Egypt, and it's interesting that the text takes pains to tell us that of the direct descendants of Abraham going into Egypt, not counting the wives and children who are, they count the boys, but the descendants of Abraham going into Egypt, even counting Joseph and his two sons, only numbers 70 people. This is hardly a great nation, 70 people. But through God's preparation and working things out, they are given a place quite separate from the population of Egypt. Now, they're in the most developed nation in the world at that time, so they certainly gain things in growing into a nation from what they learn in Egypt. But they're in a separate place, separate from the Egyptian population. They're raising their animals and doing their agricultural things. And in the land of Goshen, interestingly, if you watch commercials, you see this is the same area where the My Pillows guy is getting his cotton for his marvelous sheets. So it's it's the Nile, not exactly the delta, but the downstream of the Nile. So it's a place that's well watered even in this time of famine. They can graze their flocks there and their herds. So Jacob arrives in Egypt. Joseph is welcomed by the Pharaoh for all he's done for Egypt. And he presents 5 of his brothers, I think, to the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh talks to them and says, now, what do you boys do? And they said, well, we're sheep raisers. And Joseph had coached them to be sure that's what they tell Pharaoh. Pharaoh says, oh, I know just the place for you. Great place to graze your flocks and herds. And it's away from my people, because we're told just incidentally at one point that the Egyptians didn't like shepherds. Don't know exactly why. I guess they were much more cotton and linen people than they were wool people. But they didn't like shepherds. So the fact these people were shepherds was helpful to keep them a separate population. But they grew, multiplied rapidly. Well, if they're all following Grandpa Jacob's example, they have big families. And finally, the Exodus story is that they reach the place where the Egyptian population cannot ignore them any longer. There's too many of them. And they say, if they're really people that are kind of like the people in Babylon and around there, and these are our enemies, and if they attack us, whose side are these people going to be on? If they attack us and they take up with the attackers, we're in real trouble. So, chapter 48, actually the closing of chapter 49. Jacob lived in Egypt 17 years, and the years of his life were 147. He was 130 when he got there, and now 17 years later he's 147. And his family has to understand that he's getting older and older, and he's not getting any stronger. So when the time drew near for Israel to die, he called for his son Joseph and said to him, "If I found favor in your eyes, put your hand under my thigh." Remember, this is what the same symbolic kind of oath-taking that Abraham did with his son who went to find the wife for that Abraham did with his servant who went to find a wife for his son. "Put your hand under my thigh and promise that you will show me kindness and faithfulness. Do not bury me in Egypt, but when I rest with my fathers, carry me out of Egypt and bury me where they are buried. I will do as you say," he said. "Swear to me," he said. Then Joseph swore to him, and Israel worshipped as he leaned on the top of his staff. You see this old man leaning on his staff and praying to God. So, sometime later, Joseph was told, "Your father is ill." He's thinking, so he takes his two sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. Now, Manasseh is the older son. And at this point, he seems to only have two sons. He takes them and he goes to visit his father. When Jacob was told, "Your son Joseph has come to you," Israel rallied his strength and sat up on the bed. He's kind of bedfast, but even at this point, he has enough strength to sit up and lean on his cane. And Jacob said to Joseph, "God Almighty," this is an interesting term. It translates the Hebrew El Shaddai, which El always means God, but the Shaddai means all-powerful, almighty, supreme. So it's interesting through the book of Genesis, the terms that they use for God change with situations. So to Jacob, now that he's grown up in his understanding and relationship with God, he says to his son Joseph, "This is about El Shaddai, God Almighty, who appeared to me at Luz." This is on his trip out, where he saw the ladder to heaven. "Appeared to me in Luz in the land of Canaan, and there he blessed me and said to me, I am going to make you fruitful and will increase your numbers. I will make you a community of peoples, and I will give this land as an everlasting possession to your descendants after you." So then his eyesight is fading a bit at this time, and he sees, who are these boys that you got with you, Joseph? "Well, these are my my two sons. Well, bring them here. And the two sons are hugging Grandpa and kissing him and talking to him, and he's talking to them. And then he says, but I want to bless them. So Joseph gets them back from Grandpa, and they stand in Grandpa, and he brings them forward. And Grandpa puts his hands on their heads to bless them. Now we're familiar with this blessing, Isaac blessing Jacob. But this is tradition of all the families of the earth around them at this point, but it's definitely something that God is using. So Jacob, Israel, reaches out and puts his hands on the heads of the boys, but he crosses his hands, and Joseph says, no, Dad, this is the oldest one. Manasseh is the oldest one. And Dad says, it's all right. I know what I'm doing. So he blesses the two boys, and in so blesses Joseph. But what he says is of interest. He says, I am adopting these two boys. From now on, they will be considered my sons, just like Joseph, like your brothers. Instead of one son, Joseph, I will now have two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And Ephraim will be the dominant one. Now, if you follow this on through, Manasseh becomes a very big tribe. Half of the tribe of Manasseh were the ones who, when they came into the land, they came into this beautiful pasture land on the east side of the Jordan. And the people of Manasseh said, this is where we want to stay. And they said, okay, if you'll just come over and help us with the conquest, then this can be. So half the tribe of Manasseh stays there, the other half goes over. So it's a big tribe. But the tribe of Ephraim settles basically in that heartland where Joseph and Jacob both had experiences with God. And Ephraim, it took me a long time to see this in my reading, but I finally began to realize that this becomes a sort of a permanent family issue that we'll see in a minute, that Judah is named as the dominant tribe, the tribe of leadership, which becomes then the tribe of kings and the tribe of the Messiah. But Ephraim, there's a sense in which Joseph is still the favored son, more so now that all this has happened. And so Ephraim, as the older, has been made the older son of Joseph, becomes kind of the dominant person in the minds of the Ephraimites and the Manasseh people and the other tribes. So when it comes to the time of Solomon and after Solomon, when rebellion arises, it's the people of Ephraim who are saying, why is Judah ruling us? Why is the temple in Judah's territory? Why are the kings from Judah? After all, we're Joseph's sons. We should be dominant. And it's out of this that this separation of the two Israels comes, that there are other things happening in the direct relationship between the people and Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. But basically, it's part of what God foresaw coming. And then you will notice in reading through the prophets and so forth that frequently that upper nation, it's called Israel, it's the 10 of the 12 tribes, so of course it would still retain the name Israel. But other than that, it's often called Ephraim. Just like the two tribes now will be called Judah, and Judea will become the name of the country, and the people who live there will be called Jews. So this is a significant thing happening. So Joseph is and his two sons are blessed by his dying father. But then chapter 49, the second last chapter of the book, is what we want to look at this morning. And it's It's a complicated chapter. No doubt you've read things about this chapter. And again, as you read it, it's full of this symbolism. It's called a poem by the scholars. It's this long poem. Well, it's not really a poem as we would think of it. You have to feel that God is, and the inspiration of the Spirit of God are involved with this. And Jacob is speaking, but he's speaking these images that God is giving him. So Jacob called his sons and said, "Gather around me so I can tell you what will happen to you in days to come." Okay. I tried to get somebody to help me understand this, so I went to J. Vernon McGee. I like to read J. Vernon McGee. And J. Vernon McGee says, I had a classmate who made a detailed study of this and wrote his research paper for his PhD on this chapter. So if you want to know more about it, get his book and read it. I thought, well, if J. Vernon McGee doesn't really want to explain all these details, I guess I don't have to either. Okay, so now he starts with the oldest, and he goes through all of his sons and gives them his blessing, but his blessing is prophetic, and it's very full of illusions that we're not sure what to make of them. Let me just say this to get you comfortable with this, that what of these illusions we understand and how they bear out in the later history of these people. But at this point in time, what is happening? Well, Jacob is saying to his sons, the promise of God is being fulfilled, and it's being fulfilled in you. God has said, "I will multiply this family into a nation." That's going to happen, and it's going to happen through you. So all these blessings that he gives his sons are saying, you now are here in Egypt, but you are going to be the kind of the sub-patriarchs. Out of you are going to become large families, and these families put together are going to become the nation. So assemble and listen, sons of Jacob. Listen to your father Israel. This idea, the very elderly patriarch, now this doesn't continue. We don't see a whole lot of it down through the history of Israel. But at these early times of the patriarchs whom God has individually singled out and made a covenant through them, then they become the spokespeople of God. They become the prophets. So he says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, the first sign of my strength. He says, Reuben, when you were born, I thought, now I've become a man. I have a son. He will be my strength. He will do things that I can't do. Excelling in honor, excelling in power. Then at verse 4, turbulent as the waters. He says, okay, Reuben, my first son, you're very strong in my family, but you're turbulent as the waters. You will no longer excel, for you went up onto your father's bed, onto my couch, and defiled it. Remember that little bit of story that the oldest boy, I don't know, some say, well, he thought it was his right as the oldest son, but I think it was just a young man being a young man and doing things he knew he shouldn't do. Goes in and has a sexual relationship, at least once, with not with his mother, of course, but with her servant. So but at this point, Jacob says, you should be the honored one as my first son, but no, you lost that honor. And I would say it's not just this one incident, it's what this one incident shows about the character of this young man. He is turbulent as the waters. You don't build houses on waters. They're not stable. So you don't build the lasting things on Reuben because he's not that stable. Simeon and Levi are brothers. They were the next two children, all children of Leah. And he says they should now be the ones who would ascend. And yet, they're the two boys who took their swords and did this plot in Shechem to get the men to be circumcised. And while they were hurting and healing from this, surprised them and killed the people of the city and stole their things. He says, their swords are weapons of violence. I have a lot of trouble with my Hebrew translation in this. If you read a different translation, I was reading this Good News one. It reads very differently. Well, that's because Hebrew is a very flexible language. It's mixed with other languages, and sometimes it's hard to know how to take something. So the King James translators saw this, and these translators see that a word here that meant weapons, meant swords, and they remember that's exactly what they did. They took their swords, are weapons of violence. Then Jacob says, Israel says, "Let me not enter their council, let me not join their assembly, for they have killed men in anger and hamstrung oxen as they pleased." This term hamstrung comes up a number of times through the Old Testament. What they did was, if people had animals that could be used for warlike purposes, horses, oxen sometimes, they would nick the animal in one leg, and then it would be lame, and it could still work, but it couldn't really run as fast or do as much. So this is called hamstringing. And interestingly, if you're a sports person like I am, the guy runs down first base and he comes up limping, and they say, "Oh, he injured his hamstring." Yeah, same thing. That same tendon, that big tendon, was what they nicked on the animal so it wouldn't be as useful. So now in reading the story, nothing is said about them doing this. They stole the animals, but there are things referenced in this chapter that we really don't know about, which just tells us we don't know everything about their lives. So anyway, our pastor preaching from James says the wrath of man, the anger of man does not work the will of God. You don't really do what God wants done by becoming so angry that you do something. And Jacob says, you boys were very hot-headed and angry, and I don't want to tie into that, so I'm bypassing you. Cursed be their anger so fierce, and their fury so cruel. Now I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. That's interesting. A couple of things we can see that kind of reflect that. When you look at a map of these tribes that become kind of states in Israel as it forms after the time of Joshua, you see that Judah is down to the south of the country, takes in most of the land that Abraham and Isaac and Jacob lived on. But south of that, into this kind of wilderness area where they would winter with their families and their flocks and things, is Simeon. Now, the interesting thing about that is that Simeon is classed with one of the 10 tribes that seceded to make the new country, but its state is south of Judah. So how does this work? Well, how it works is that the people of Simeon really didn't have such a good place there to build on. So they went north and mixed with the others. I will disperse them in Israel. Now, what about Levi? Well, interestingly, Levi becomes the tribe of priests, and they get no state, they get no property. God is their property. So they live in villages and towns throughout the rest of the country. So he literally scattered Levi through the rest of the country. So interesting that I will scatter them in Jacob and disperse them in Israel. For Simeon, it almost means that Simeon sort of disappears, never to really be seen clearly again. Levi becomes one of the very significant tribes. Now we get to Judah, the fourth son. Having bypassed 3 sons, Judah now becomes very significant. Judah, your brothers will praise you. It's interesting that the word Judah, when we say it, it means actually, it's hard to explain this, that it's a word that when you say it, it sounds like the Hebrew word for praise. It's not exactly the same word, but it sounds like it. So, in a sense, Judah means praise. And when you go back to the story of the birth of these boys, when the 4th boy was born, Leah finally said, well, now I'm finally going to be the wife in this family because I have 4 boys and she doesn't have any. And so she named Judah Praise. So your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Really? Well, since David and Solomon and all the kings from them are all of the tribe of Judah, I think this would primarily refer to the time of David, when the people of Judah are the rulers of the world. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. The rest of the tribes would honor David as king. You remember, it's kind of an interesting story in that, isn't there? David was anointed to be king, and then Saul tried to kill him so that he wouldn't, so that he could keep the reign for his son Jonathan. But that didn't happen. Saul and Jonathan then are killed in battle. And David now knows that he's supposed to be king, but he sets up a kind of a homeland in Hebron, and he waits, and eventually the tribes come to him and ask him to be king. So then he becomes king of the whole nation. Your father's sons will bow down to you. You are a lion's cub, O Judah. You return from the prey, my son. Like a lion, he crouches and lies down. Like a lioness, who dares to rouse him? Again, the translations are kind of varied when you read other translations. But interestingly, you get to the book of Revelation, the wrap-up of the Bible, and John is transported into this heavenly realm to see things of significance. And what does he find there? They have this scroll that is supposed to contain the prophecy of things to come, and nobody can open it. Nobody can read it. And John is saying, oh my, we'll never know. And he's very emotional about this. And then one of the angels says to him, don't worry about it. The Lion of the tribe of Judah will take care of this. And who is the Lion of the tribe of Judah? The same one who's the Lamb in Revelation. The Christ, Jesus, the Son of God. So the Lion is associated with Judah. Now, verse 10. Verse 10 just drives me crazy. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs, and the obedience of the nations is his. In the King James, it says, till Shiloh comes. Now, for my birthday, I had my wife buy me a Hebrew dictionary. I thought, this is going to solve all my problems. It didn't. So I'm researching this, and I find out that the word Shiloh basically comes from a word that means peace or harmony. And then I find out that when they moved the tabernacle in and set up the tabernacle in Canaan, they set it up at a place that they named Shiloh, a place of peace, a place of God. So why doesn't the word Shiloh appear in this translation? Because you don't know whether this Hebrew word is intended to be a name or whether it was intended to say something about. So the King James translators took the Hebrew word Shiloh and made it a name till Shiloh comes. So all your old preachers that you probably are familiar with will talk about Jesus is called Shiloh. He is the one to come. In this translation and in that translation, the word Shiloh doesn't appear until he comes to whom it belongs. They're seeing this word Shiloh should be translated. And somehow these translators felt it refers to someone who's coming. And the obedience of the nations is his. Certainly, if you have a King James Bible like I have, or you see a star out opposite this verse, which means this is a messianic text. Well, sure it is. Then he says, he will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. What does that mean? Well, it is interesting that Jesus rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, on a colt of a donkey. And the vine, you see, Jesus himself uses it, and the prophets use this idea of the vine or the tree as symbolic of this nation. So he will tether his donkey to a vine, his colt to the choicest branch. Seems to be saying what Zechariah says, your king will come to you humble and riding on a donkey, and a colt, the foal of a donkey. He will wash his garments in wine, his robes in the blood of grapes. There's a great passage from Isaiah saying, who is this that comes from Basra, and why are his garments so red? He has tread the winepress of God alone. You see this in the Battle Hymn of the Republic. He's treading out the grapes of wrath, So this also seems to be some reference to Christ. In the book of Revelation, when Jesus comes leading the army at the end, they say, why are his garments red like he's been tromping out the grapes? Well, because this redness is a symbol of his blood. In fact, his robes in the blood of grapes, so this translation says. His eyes will be darker than wine, or some of the translations say his eyes will be bloodshot from drinking wine. Mm-hmm. I have trouble with that. His teeth whiter than milk, but these are expressions of honor, of glory that somehow rests on the descendants of Judah. So this passage becomes very interesting and is often referred to. When I got to that in J. Vernon McGee, he just went ballistic. Woo, look at this. Here's the Christ. And I'm thinking, yes, lots of the old preachers did. Okay, then just like that, we switch to Zebulun, and we almost say nothing about him. He will live by the seashore. His land didn't actually go all the way to the Mediterranean, but it was only like 10 miles from the edge of his borders to the Mediterranean. And in that prophecy that we read at Christmas from the 9th chapter of Isaiah, it talks about the people who dwell it talks about the people of Galilee and kind of references them as a seashore people, and become a haven for ships. His border will extend towards Sidon. Now, Sidon is one of the great ports of the world. The great trading ships come from Sidon. Okay, but that's all he says about Zebulun. And I don't know that we need to know anymore, but he does indicate that Zebulun will produce enough people that they will be a province. They will live by the seashore and become a haven for ships, his border, but he means all of his descendants, will extend towards Sidon. Issachar is a raw-boned donkey lying between two saddlebags. I'd like to explain that to you if only I could. But, it again, at least it means to us that he's saying to each of these sons, you and your people are going to survive, and you're going to be back in the country that God is giving to you, and you're going to be a significant people. When he sees how good is his resting place and how pleasant is his land, he will bend his shoulders to the burden and submit to forced labor. Now, of course, they all became slaves in Egypt, but he's sort of talking about something that I don't know from the history of Israel, that the people of Issachar will become slaves at one point, be forced laborers. Dan will provide justice for his people as one of the tribes of Israel. Dan will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites at the horse's heels, so that its riders tumble backward. That doesn't sound like a very nice description. Okay, in the book of Judges, there's a terrible passage toward the end of it where the people of Dan get involved in some very despicable, very bloody thing. And as such, for a while, the rest of the tribes shut them out. And it gets to the place where they don't have enough women in their tribe to marry the men to keep the tribe alive. And so they pull up from the land that was first given to them, and they go north and found their own land up north of the waters of the Jordan, up above the Sea of Galilee, so that they become part of the description of when we're talking about all of Israel. We talk about from Dan to Beersheba. Dan is the furthest north point, Beersheba is the furthest south point. Now, interesting, just point something out to you, that in the book of Revelation, there's a passage that talks about the 144,000, 12,000 from each tribe, and it lists the tribes. But you read it, there's no tribe of Dan in the list. There are 12 tribes because Levi is listed and Manasseh is listed, but instead of Ephraim, Joseph is listed. Kind of ties back to this, but no Dan. I don't really have an explanation for that, but I do see that in this, he sort of depicts Dan as being not really the best of tribes. He will be a serpent by the roadside, a viper along the path that bites the horse's heels so that its rider tumbles backward. Now, verse 18 is interesting. I look for your deliverance, O Lord. Does Jacob, after giving this prophecy that God has given him, say to himself, wow. So then he says, okay, God, I don't know what you're going to do with this, but I look to you for delivering these people. Gad will be attacked by a band of raiders, but he will attack them at their heels. I don't know what to make of that, except again, Gad will be a state in Israel. Asher's food will be rich. He will provide delicacies fit for a king. I'm sure if I knew more about the history of these tribes, I would see more there. Naphtali is a doe set free that bears beautiful fawns. Well, see the tribe continuing to grow. Now we get to Joseph. Okay. If you're reading in the King James, and you happen to be reading a Book of Mormon, you find out that the Mormons, I don't understand, that the Mormons have this idea that the Native Americans, what we call the American Indians, somehow are the lost 10 tribes. But what does that have to do with them? None of the early Mormons were really Native Americans. They were Europeans who came here like everybody else. But they see in this thing about Joseph, this becomes a great Mormon idea. Joseph is a fruitful vine near a spring whose branches climb over a wall. They say, see, there it is. Joseph's people, those from the 10 tribes, Ephraim and Manasseh and the others, are lost someplace, but they cross the ocean somehow. He describes how they did that, which you will not find very understandable. And they become the North American Indians. With bitterness, archers attack him. They shoot at him with hostility. They see their own struggles in that. But his bow remained steady. His strong arms stayed limber because of the hand of the mighty one of Jacob, because of the shepherd, the rock of Israel. I again see that. I don't see what the Mormons see in this. I see Joseph as being separated from his brothers and yet becoming more productive than any of them. He has 2 tribes that descend from him, and they're both big major tribes. So I see this as referring to, his branches climb over a wall, which simply means that he spreads out. He's not shut in. And this is because of the mighty one of Jacob, that would be El Shaddai, because of the shepherd, and God calls himself a shepherd in the Old Testament, but when we think of the shepherd, we think of Jesus as the good shepherd. The rock of Israel, there we certainly connect this idea with Jesus. Because of your Father's God who helps you, because of the Almighty who blesses you with blessings of the heavens above and blessings of the deep that lies below, blessings of the breast and the womb, lots of descendants. Your Father's blessings are greater than the blessings of the ancient mountains. Now, in the King James, it talks about the everlasting hills. And the Mormons say, look, this must mean the Rocky Mountains. And where are we? In Salt Lake City, in the Rocky Mountains. Got to be us. I don't understand that. But I do see that more is said about Joseph than all the others put together almost, because Joseph still is the favorite. And Jacob is still saying Joseph's people are going to become deeply significant. The bounty of the age-old hills, that's what the Mormons see as I think, what about the Alps? But no, it's got to be the Rocky Mountains. Let all these rest on the head of Joseph, on the brow of the prince among his brothers. See, he's still making Joseph the most important one, even though he gave Judah the role of being kings and leaders. Now, Benjamin is a ravenous wolf. In the morning he devours the prey, in the evening he divides the plunder. The first king of Israel, Saul, was a Benjaminite. Actually, the Apostle Paul is a Benjaminite. But the Benjaminites were noted warriors. They were mentioned several times that the army people from Benjamin were among the best warriors. So a ravenous wolf doesn't sound too good to us, but Judah is a lion, Benjamin is a wolf. And he devours his prey. They were very successful in military things. And in the evening he divides the plunder. All these are the 12 tribes of Israel, and this is what their father said to them when he blessed them, giving each the blessing appropriate to him. So as Moses is writing this, he's saying these blessings are really significant if you knew what they meant. Now, it's my time. It's about running out. Then he gave them these instructions. I am about to be gathered to my people. Bury me with my fathers in the cave in the field of Ephron, the Hittite, the cave in the field of Machpelah, near Mamre in Canaan, which Abraham bought as a burial place from Ephron the Hittite along with the field. There Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. There Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried. There I buried Leah. Now, in spite of the fact that Rachel is all the favored wife and her sons the favored sons, still Leah is much more the mother of this family. So it's Leah who's buried in the cave, and Jacob will not be buried next to Rachel. He will be buried next to Leah. Now, J. Vernon McGee is very strong on the idea that the patriarchs believed strongly in a physical resurrection, and so they wanted their bodies buried in the land so that they will be raised. I don't quite see this. I mean, there's not that much mention of it. Later you get into devotional scriptures and you see that the ancient people and the Pharisees believed strongly in a resurrection. The Sadducees didn't believe there was any resurrection. When you're dead, you just were dead. That's it. But anyway, what I see more is that this passage is saying you're in Egypt, you're going to stay in Egypt for a long time, you're going to have a tough time in Egypt, but that is not where this nation is going to be. This nation is going to be back in Canaan. So these two patriarchs, Jacob and later Joseph, are saying, we don't want to be buried in Egypt. Now, the others were all buried in Egypt, presumably, but Jacob is taken in this grand procession that we'll talk about next week, taken up with all the Egyptians going with him and having a funeral of all funerals. I'm sure the people who were left after this difficult time were saying, wow, what is this? All of the sons were there, all of the Egyptians were there. They had this great funeral for Jacob. But when he finished these instructions to his sons, he drew his feet up into the bed, breathed his last, and was gathered to his people. He did this, and then he just lay down in the bed and died. Well, he was apparently on his deathbed at the time, but he sits up and gives this long chapter of material so strongly, and then he's finished his life. That's what he needed to do. So he dies. So we'll pick up chapter 50, and we'll kind of review where we've been with this whole story next week. Have time for some questions or comments. Still have a few minutes. Anything you want to straighten me out on any of this that I don't seem to understand? Maybe I shouldn't have made so much about the Mormons, and because you may or may not know about that. But it just seems odd that the interpretation of this paragraph would play so strongly in the founding of Mormonism, and yet I don't understand how it works. Joseph Smith was not a Native American. Brigham Young was not a Native American. All I know about the Mormons and the Native Americans is some stories that when other settlers tried to come in and take over land in their area, that some of their vigilantes dressed up like Indians and pretended to be Native Americans and attacked the wagon trains and turned them away. And that's how come they kept that portion of land distinctly for their Mormon people. Now it's a mixed place now, and yet still pretty dominated by Mormonism. So anyway, this is an interesting chapter. The other than that part and sorting it out, there's the messianic references in what he says about Judah. But it all does, if you just don't get too worried about some of these things that are hard to interpret, he is saying to them, now my sons, you are going to become that nation that God promised, and you are going to go back and settle in Canaan, and it's going to be your country. Don't you see that in all of this? It will be your country. Oh, one more little thing. A while back, I got a hold of a book. I'm always interested in these crazy things. By some prophecy, I would say prophecy nuts, but in this case, prophecy students, who were saying that in this, and I couldn't really tell you what they were interpreting, there's a reference to prosperity in one of the tribes, and that what's being predicted, they say, is that under the nation of Israel, there's a pool of oil that nobody has ever found. And Israel in the last days are going to tap into this pool of oil, just in time for the world to stop using oil, I guess. But anyway, it's going to make Israel rich, and that's why that in Ezekiel and in the book of Revelation, it talks about the nations attacking Israel in the last days to get their oil. So there's all kinds of things come out of this chapter, but I wouldn't worry too much about any of them except to see that it is a significant chapter following God's promise that what he said to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob is going to come true. They are finally going to be a nation and going to own and occupy the land of Canaan. And the tribes are going to have different kinds of experiences in this, but they're all going to be part of it. So, okay, last thoughts? All right, I'll tell you, I've been studying all week long and thinking, how am I going to explain some of this to my class? And finally I realized I'm not going to explain it to my class because I don't understand it myself. The parts I do understand, I shared with you, or the parts I think I understand. But the other references, I don't know quite what to make of them, but I think they have symbolic significance. Incidentally, if you get deep enough into history that you read the book of First Chronicles, you will find quite some parallel between the book of First Chronicles and this chapter, because the book of First Chronicles is full of tracing the heritage, tracing the genealogies. And so the chronicle writer goes back to this chapter and kind of connects some of what he sees at the time he's writing a history of the nation, connecting back to Jacob's blessings of his sons. I read that, I thought, I could get caught in this and we could spend a month on it, but I don't think you really want to do that. So anyway, I will, next week we'll look at chapter 50. Not a whole lot of real, there's significant closing of the book there. There's an old saying that the book of Genesis begins in a garden in Eden and ends in a coffin in Egypt. Well, that's exactly true. The first of it is the garden in Eden. The last thing in the book of Genesis we'll see next week is Joseph is embalmed. Jacob was embalmed also. That means they were made mummies. Now, nobody's ever found their mummies, but and Joseph's mummy stays there in Egypt, in a sarcophagus someplace, until they're ready to leave 400 years later. But they know where it is, and they go and get Joseph's mummy and take it. They don't bury Joseph in the same cave, I don't think. I think there's reference to Jacob saying that he owned land up by Shechem, which we know he did. The text tells us that he bought it. In the book of this, at the end of the book of Genesis, he says something about having taken it from the people that were there with his bow and with his sword. I don't know anything about that, except for the two boys attacking the people of Shechem. But anyway, this connects to the Jacob's well story in John chapter 4. There's apparently a piece of land that Jacob actually possessed as his own, and he gives that land to Joseph, which works out well because it falls within the tribe of Ephraim. So Joseph himself is buried in the land, in the area of Ephraim. And nobody is buried with Rachel in her tomb outside Bethlehem. It's not really a cave tomb like the one that Abraham has, but there's a burial place there of some sort that the writer says is still visible when they get back to the land centuries later. So it's all very interesting, some of it very confusing. All right. If you're not going to enlighten me on anything significant here, we'll close. And afterwards, you may want to talk about something in a more private way. I'd be very interested in anything you have to say. Father, we thank you again for your word. Thank you for your spirit that is always guiding the things that are recorded in your word and the recording of it and saving it for us in ways that the writers could not anticipate, that all these millennia later, we still would be reading the things that they wrote and searching out the significance of them. But we thank you for your word and thank you for giving us the opportunity to study it together in Jesus' name. Amen.